The big contradiction is they cannot resolve the fundamental contradiction behind the economic crisis. What is that? Why is this the most severe and permanent crisis of the world capitalist system in the history of development of capitalism? Or as Fred Goldstein's book puts it, why is capitalism at a dead end? Most of the time when we talk about the effect that technology being introduced into the economy, as well as globalization and what that's done to the working class, we usually think about it in terms of its terrible impact on the workers, busting unions, cutting wages, causing layoffs, et cetera, et cetera. And that's right, because that's the first thing that comes to workers and poor people's mind. But we should also pay attention to what globalization and technology has done to the capitalist system. You know, in other words, the concern on the other side of the class barricade. All of this technology and all of this globalization has made the productive forces in the capitalist economy far, far more advanced than they have ever been in the history of, in history, And they are so, when I say productive forces, and I know some of this may be confusing to some of you, but we'll have time during the week, especially for those of you who are attending classes, to go over it. What I mean by the productive forces of the economy, that's the combination of the means of production, greatly enhanced by technology, plus labor. All of that is so advanced now that it is impossible to reconcile these advanced productive forces with the chaotic and irrational capitalist economy. At an earlier time, when the crisis of overproduction created by the productive forces occurred, the capitalists could they never completely controlled it, but they could kind of control it by inducing a recession. What some of the economists used to call creative destruction. The capacity in the economy is too great, so what we will do, we'll close some factories and plants, we'll lay off millions of workers around the world, a lot of people will be thrown out of their house, the weaker capitalist businesses will flop, the weaker banks will flop, they'll be swallowed up by the bigger banks, and then after a certain period of time, the capitalist economy will reboot itself. See? But right now, because of the incredibly advanced nature of the productive forces in the economy, the crisis of overproduction is no longer just a cyclical crisis. It is a permanent crisis. It is a monster on everyone. And no one knows really what to do with it. What does this mean for us? Well, let me just say a little bit more what it means for capitalism. To compensate for their inability to get profits by expanding when the economy is not expanding, they have been forced to rely more and more on the financial markets. And actually, if you read Lenin on imperialism, this should be familiar to you, because what he predicted, as he talked about what imperialism would look like as it decayed and as the price of statement, is that one of his features would be that the economy would be more and more dependent on the financial markets and the banks, and less dependent on actual producing commodities. Well, this is what has happened, you see. Lenin predicted it, and if I'm not mistaken, I think a few years ago in one of his wonderful essays, Fidel Castro coined the word casino capitalism. Anybody ever heard of that? He was talking about the same phenomenon. The problem with this reliance on the financial markets, as a way to compensate for the profit you're not getting by production, is that you create these enormous bubbles, like the housing crisis, and they burst, and they make things 1,000 times worse. And the bubbles that burst, along with the contraction of the economy, creates this enormous debt crisis, which is what you hear a lot about. And you know who they try to solve? that on whose back they try to solve the debt crisis on. It's the workers and the poor of the world. This is all the union busting. This is whether it's the private economy or the public sector, education, healthcare, proposals to privatize stuff. Actually, a lot of this political argument may be ratcheted up by Romney's selection of Paul Ryan as his vice presidential running mate. I don't know what political impact that will have on anything, but it'll be out there because he is the point person for the Tea Party on, let's just cut everything, let's liberate workers from their dependency on any kind of assistance on food, whatever, This is key to understanding what's happening in Greece, where because of the banks, the average wages of the workers have been cut 60% in less than a decade. Or what's happening in a place like Scranton, Pennsylvania. How many of you heard about Scranton, Pennsylvania? Medium-sized town. What the mayor did at the dictation of the banks was reduce the salaries of all of the workers, including the policemen, fire, whatever, medical, health workers that work for the city, from an average of $29 to $39 an hour to minimum wage, to $7.25. And if I'm not mistaken, the workers were not able to fight back. See, this is how they're dealing with the debt crisis. But it gets worse. It gets worse, comrades and friends. With all the cuts that are going down, the system, the capitalist system, is being pushed by what it's about in the direction of destroying more and more of the productive forces. The destruction of the productive forces on a global basis has only begun. If capitalism is to continue, that destruction of the productive forces must deepen. And there's a lot of arguing within capitalist circles over how they're going to do that. Some say, well, we got to do it, or else we'll have no system. The system will never be able to reboot itself. Where others say that if we allow for the unrestrained destruction of the productive forces on a worldwide basis, the social and political and economic impact of that would be such that the world would be pushed into a depression that it may not be able to get out of. The medicine may kill the patient. And this is what they're fighting about, What should we be concerned with? This is clearly a political crisis for the working class movement. For the most part, again, whether it's labor or whether it's activists fighting around any number of issues, we tend to be fighting, we tend to be defensive, stop them from doing this, stop this cut, stop that cut. We tend to be industry, focused, stop this in this industry, stop this in the public sector, and it tends to be local, see. That's all good and well, but it's as though there's an enormous cloud that is this huge, deepening worldwide capitalist crisis that, is hanging over the entire planet. And the cloud really hasn't burst. There have been storms, there have been rain, a few hurricanes, inclement weather, but the clouds have not really burst. And when they burst, it's going to be a tsunami. It's going to be a social, political, and economic tsunami. Unimaginable in our lifetimes. And people, understandably so, are not looking up at the clouds. They're looking at what's in front of them. And I think the movement is the same way. We're not looking at what's coming. They're looking at what's in front of them. See? Somehow, we've got to get as many of us as possible to understand what's coming, so we prepared to fight it on a wider basis. The ruling class, for quite some time, the capitalist ruling class, has torn up what many consider to be the norms of the relationship between classes, meaning that we will exploit you, we will rip you off, we will keep you down, but we'll give you enough so that you don't rebel against us. Well, that's all over. That deal has been torn up. We all know that. The problem is that the working class and working class organizations have not done the same thing. They have not torn up their deal that as long as you kind of give us, you know, a living and maybe a little more than that, then we will say, hey, then the deal's over. We're kicking the table over from our side too, and you know, we're going to overthrow the system, and our whole perspective becomes different. Our class hasn't gotten to that point. But the point that we're making is that our class needs to get to that point as soon as possible. Not all together, not in some schematic way. It's an uneven development, but clearly that's the direction that we have to move in. In conclusion, comrades and friends, you know, you can even trace the development of the Occupy movement in some of what I'm saying. The Occupy movement had many impetus. It's not my job to go into it. The rebellion of the youth on a worldwide basis because of how the crisis is kicking their ass. But this is also true. One of the reasons that the Occupy movement came on the scene, not just in New York and where it spread to Charlotte and Oakland, but you know, when it first kind of opened up in North Africa and then moved to Europe and Spain and Greece and Athens and Rome and so forth, it was because the inability of the labor unions and those organizations that workers and poor people have traditionally, you know, relied upon to fight in their interests, they were not doing it. And so there was a huge vacuum. And Occupy, to a large extent, developed in this vacuum. But in a way, whatever their contradictions, whatever their problems were, they kind of showed us the way. You know, we've got to throw the gloves off and attack the system. Our struggle has to become wider. It can't just be a struggle of thousands and thousands of small, isolated battles, although it will take on that character for some time. And we must support that. But more and more, our struggle has to be larger and larger geographically, even transcending national boundaries, so that it's class against class. And I could explain how it's more practical for that class against class battle to take place on a worldwide basis for lots of reasons. But I'll save that for another time. And also, it has to become more anti-capitalist. And ultimately, it has to be about a struggle for power. When we're ready, we'll talk more and more about some of our proposal to launch People's Power Assemblies. And People's Power Assemblies will be all about fighting for power, all about claiming that, and I think a lot of people will be with us, that any legislature, city council, state legislature, the U.S. Congress, the president, the governor, whatever, any capitalist political body or politician who fails to represent the interests of the workers and the poor, as opposed to representing the interests of the banks, as far as we're concerned, they're undemocratic, and the masses should form their own democratic institutions from which to exert pressure and power, and ultimately, at some point in the not too distant future, to prevail. Thank you.